they're able to get a job with us, get back in school and whatnot. What I want to talk about today is the connection of the brain and what we've learned at HopeWorks, especially in the last 5 years, to trauma and toxic stress, and how our organization has changed its whole vision because of how we've begun to understand the brain and what happens to the brain when what we would say here at this conference is when injustice happens. So my experience is a lot of times we can talk about injustice, but we're not very aware of how people have been hurt. And because of that, we tend to work to stop injustice, but not to help people heal. Does that make sense? So if any questions anytime, please, we're small enough. So I'm going to try to do this in a different way than I've done before, so I'm going to see if it works. So one of the things that got us really started in this is that we stopped liking our youth. So a little over 5 years ago, I experienced myself and my staff as overwhelmed. And people would come to us, and we had always kind of prided ourselves in welcoming youth. So youth would start, we created a really safe place. We were in an old row home. But what we began to do was say something like, Samantha, you're late. Go home and come back in a month when you can be on time. Never said that before. Never said that. And we were punishing and being punitive. So I called us together and I said, what's going on? And people said, we're stressed. We're stressed. And so their solution to me as the executive director was I needed to hire double the amount of people and they needed to work double, less time. Right? Well, that wasn't going to happen, right? We were at 70% capacity. But people's experience was being stressed and terribly overwhelmed. What I understand now is that we actually had become an organization that was vicariously traumatized. We actually were acting as though we had experienced trauma because we had been so overexposed to trauma in our community. In a sense, we had become irradiated. It's like being around a reactor. So one of the ways that we began to think about this, I'm going to go kind of quickly. This is Adrian Peterson, a football player, so just bear with me if you're not into football. What you just need to know about him is 4 years ago, he tore his knee really bad, his ACL, his MCL, and they said he might not ever come back and play football. 10 months later, he came back, and he didn't only come back, but he almost broke the single-season rushing record. He rushed for over 2,000 yards. It's like a monster season in the NFL. He missed it by 7 yards. And people were like, how did you do that, Adrian? You must have so much grit. You must have so much determination. You must be so strong, right? Your will is so amazing. You have so much resiliency. And I like to say, I like his story, because I like to say that 3 things happened, I think, before any of that. And the very first one is captured right here. Is that when he was injured, the game stopped. Seems obvious, right? He fell to the turf, the game stopped. But what I want to submit to you today is that when my youth who I work with in Camden get hurt, the game doesn't stop. People in Camden get hurt, and they continue to have to be in the game. So it would be like this guy here who's terribly hurt, continuing to play football. And we couldn't understand or see that he had a bad knee. All we could see was he wasn't doing well. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. So what might we do if he was acting like that? What would you do if you were his coach? Okay, yeah, you could take him out of the game, right? What might you say to him if you took him out of the game?
Get a foot there.
We know you can't see his knee. See, this is the tough thing. So you're dogging him. What's the matter with you? Why aren't you up to snuff? Do you need more practice? Maybe we get you more reps, right? We could say all these kind of things. Or what might we also say? He's been really good. He's not performing well. What might he need?
Doctor.
What's that?
Doctor.
Okay. I might say, because you might think he's sick, but let's pretend like we can't say that, just along with the imagery here. We might say he needs more help on the team. So we might get him more resources, an offensive line. We do that all the time with the youth that I work with. We say, you need a longer school day. Let's get you food, right? You need medicine. You need all these things that are deficit driven. You're missing things. If we give them to you, you'll respond and be able to run and play in the game. The problem is we continue to create situations where our youth, or Adrian Peterson in this case, has a bad knee. And what we're learning today is that you do need an offensive line to play football, if you understand football, but you also need a good knee. And so what I want to talk about today is how we can focus on not only common ways to think of getting the deficits met, but how we can heal the knee. So one of the things that has really come up in my work has been that we have to work on empathy, right? Empathy is the key thing. And empathy means that we have to approach and draw near to the person who's hurt. And one of the things to realize is that the youth that I work with, 80% live below the poverty line. 1 in 39 are assaulted violently every year. 70% drop out of high school. When they're 14 and 15 years old and have lived through that, they've developed amazing coping mechanisms, ways to survive, that I oftentimes deride. They're not on time. They're smoking weed, right? They can be really loud and tell you to fuck off. If they get mad, they can be hyper-aroused and go off, right? They can't commit, supposedly, right? All these things that, in a sense, I characterize as bad, oftentimes are behaviors that help them stave off what's happened to them. But I hadn't learned, and we as an organization hadn't learned to ask what had happened to them. We always would say, why are you doing these things, right? So oftentimes it's not what we want, right? When we draw close to someone who's in pain, the pain that we experience is not something we want, the way they survive, but we need to understand that it's a way that's helped them. This is incredibly important, the empathetic stance. And we can actually cultivate that in the organization. Now I want to show you this picture. This is actually a picture of Lisa, and she weighed 410 pounds in that picture, 407 pounds. And she lost a whole bunch of weight. She went down about 150, I think, 2 in that picture, and that's her as a baby. Right? In which of these pictures do you think does she feel the least safe? Where's she most vulnerable?
Middle.
The middle one? Why the middle one?
Because she's an adult, but she's a small adult who's not able to protect herself. As a baby, you would expect that your parents would protect you. And as a large woman, people would tend to not make you the first choice for an assault.
So you know what? That's absolutely right. So where we go with this is about 20 years ago in San Diego, a doctor named Vince Folletti was doing work in an obesity clinic where he would help people lose immense amounts of weight through a liquid diet. And what he was noticing was that people would lose lots of weight, and then they would stop coming, they would stop having success, they would start to put on a lot of weight. And through this, what happened was with her, she came in one time and she said, I don't know what's going on. I gained 32 pounds in a month. So she got all the way down, and then she gained 32 pounds. Vince Folletti said he couldn't believe that. He didn't think that was possible for the human person to gain that much weight in a month. So they started talking, and she said that she was waking up at night or in the morning, and her whole kitchen was a mess. And she said, I'm having the night eats. He goes, what's that? She goes, well, clearly I'm getting up eating and eating and eating. So they began to pursue a kind of curiosity about this, and it comes out that what had begun to happen, and you're right on, she lost all this weight, she's working, she started to get hit on. And she was a victim of sexual abuse. No one ever talked about it. She hadn't talked about it, right? Her overeating, her skin, literally her flesh, right? Exactly what you said, was an armor. Dr. Folletti, in a sense, de-armed her. She didn't have the defense that she had learned, and in a sense, now she was terrified. She was unsafe. So people learn from this, people learn behaviors, and Folletti started thinking about this. He then started asking his patients, by mistake, when he was doing a medical intake, how much did you weigh? He didn't need to ask this. How much did you weigh when you first became sexually active? And someone said 62 pounds. And he realized he slipped, but what he really realized was when the person said 62 pounds. Right? This was back in the late 80s. He said at that point he only had 2 patients who had talked about sexual abuse. He began to ask that question, and that week he had 8. Right? So he begins to pursue this course of understanding that oftentimes people's behavior, the behavior he was encountering in his obesity clinic, actually was helpful to people. Right? he begins to explore this and develops out what we call the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And it deals with the brain. So the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, like when you and I, or lots of people, when we experience stress, it's like a sine wave. We get stressed and we come down, right? We get stressed and we come down. We get stressed, we come down. Folks that I work with, or folks who live in toxic stress, they get stressed and then they stay hyper-aroused, right? When you stay hyper-aroused, we have like names for that, like half-cocked, right? You're really ready to go off. But it's not just that you're ready to go off, it impacts your brain because you're secreting an overabundance of stress hormones that actually alter your brain. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But 3 primary ways that people are hyper-aroused and where they can go off: fight, flight, or freeze. So I had a youth one time, Moose, who would always wear a hoodie, even when it's hot, and she would cinch it, and she always had earphones dangling, and one day she didn't come in for 5 days. And I said, when she came in, I said, Moose, what are you doing? You haven't been here. You're going to lose your job, right? What do I sound like? Like I sound like a normal person talking as though people have normal stress, right? Moose says, I was really stressed. I said, well, what did you do? She goes, I went home and laid on my bed and listened to my music. I said, you did that for 5 days? And she said, yes. So Luz has a way of coping. Now I understand, because I know Luz, what's going on now. I understand what she was doing. But what I also understand is that that behavior isn't going to be helpful to Luz if she wants to have a future and thrive. And that's all the kind of future that we want to talk about, right? A full life. And yet if I don't understand how to bridge her laying down for 5 days to a life of thriving, I don't think I'm going to be able to actually be an agent of justice in the world. So let's look at the brain, right? So when the brain is over saturated in hormones, stress hormones, then lots of things can happen. So I just wanted to do a little itty-bitty brain stuff. So there's like, 2 really important times in the brain: early childhood, like the last 6 months in the womb to the first 2 years, and then puberty. The brain is doing all these crazy growing things, right? Lots is going on. One of the things that I found out that I found really interesting is I always used to think that the brain was sort of developed and you load information into it, right? So you just have to load information into it. All of us have the same brain. Not true. The brain actually develops in a way that it has to have opportunity to develop. So they've done this experiment, which is a little bit kind of gross, where they took kittens and they actually sewed an eyelid of a kitten shut for 90 days. And when they undid it after 90 days, the eye's functional, but the cat can't see out of the eye. That literally, as the cat's brain is developing, it misses the ability to connect the optic nerve and these kind of things in its brain so it can function. So the point is that, in a sense, we have the material of the brain, but the brain is developing as we grow. And if we don't get what we need, we miss different things. And so we become impaired, in a sense. The other thing that we find out is that not only is the brain changing with all the stress, but why people get sick, and we're going to see some statistics here about why people get sick from the ACE study, is because it impacts our gene. We call it epigenetics. So the stress hormones, what we're learning, they create these proteins, and some of the people might understand this a lot more better, but that the proteins actually turn the genes on and off, and that's why we develop cancers, why we get depressed, why we have heart conditions. All sorts of things happen because it's happening at the genome, at that level within us. We're learning tons of stuff about this today. We know that genes can be turned on and off. We can't do it ourselves. What we do know is that context can do that. So as I said, Dr. Fletty, I'm going really fast. Dr. Fletty developed what we call the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And it's based on the fact that behavior makes sense. So he gave this study to 17,000 people in his Kaiser Permanente medical practice. Folks were pretty much, had 60-some% had secondary ed experience. It was kind of a demographic that was non-traditional, say sort of from Camden. Okay, it would not be a Camden demographic. Of that, he found that 2/3 of people experienced 1 or more adverse childhood experiences, and he grouped them in these 3 groupings right here. So abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So all this is online, you can find it, but you can kind of see some of this is around physical or sexual abuse, emotional abuse. if you have a mental illness in the house, if you've experienced suicide in the house. So in a sense, it's not that you've experienced multiple instances of physical abuse, it's that you've experienced multiple types of adversity. That's how we measure it. So on a scale of 0 to 10. So the statistics I'm going to show you now are about that. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going really fast. Okay. So if we look at this, this is pretty amazing. So we get outcomes, adverse outcomes, and you can see some of these, that we oftentimes think of trying to stop, but Folletti wants to argue that the outcomes, the behaviors, are really symptoms of the adverse childhood experiences that people have had. So he oftentimes will say that in trying to get rid of a symptom, say like depression, it's equivalent to turning a fan on smoke and then we burn the house down. Because we're trying to get rid of the smoke, but we don't really realize there's a fire behind the smoke. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's just like the woman. We want to say, oh, you need to lose all this weight. But in a sense, we don't understand how the weight has functioned. So he's going to talk about how all these function as an outcome of adverse childhood experiences. So like one of the really cool things we found is COPD. You have higher incidences, the higher your ACE score. We find that the stress hormone actually is what causes your lung to harden. So the over kind of abundance of a certain kind of hormone actually is what causes your lung to have a problem. Lots of times we would treat COPD as COPD. We now know why it's happening, right? And if you look at this, this is kind of amazing. If you have an ACE score of 1 to 3, you're 1 out of 9. You are 1 out of 9 folks are going to smoke. So you can just see this. It's 1 out of 16, 1 out of 9, 1 out of 6, right? So there's some incredible statistics here about how the more adversity that you have, statistically, the likelihood of poor health outcomes. It doesn't mean it will happen. What it means is if you aren't aware of it and you don't do something with it, you have a high likelihood of something like this happening. The good news is if we know about it, we can do something about it, right? So I just want to make sure just everyone can see this. I have all this online, you can look at it. One of the amazing statistics, if you have a 6 or higher, you are on average of 20 years less. The young men in my program were testing at 5.7. So this is all from this study, right? Now what I want to say when I show you the next slide is this stuff here, this is what it means for us to do justice, huh? What's it like for us to draw close to people who are depressed or who have diabetes, multiple suicide attempts, right? Who have some cancer, who are obese, who are smoking, alcoholic, drug usage. What's it like to draw close to folks like that? It can create stress, right? Do you like to be around alcoholics who are drinking? And yet, what I'm going to argue today is that it's precisely our job. Right? So this is a painting that I like, right? So I call this the 4 men and women of non-vomit adversity. This is a picture of Jesus coming across the Sea of Galilee. We use this at HopeWorks a lot, and you'll notice one of the apostles here is puking. And we use this because we have this story, and this is how we changed a lot, where our board president used to run a behavior hospital, and I came in one day, the story goes, and was complaining to Chuck because the patients were really throwing up a lot. I'm like, I'm really tired of it, Chuck. I'm just tired of it, right? I'm tired of this behavior. Stop it. And he listened to me for a while. This is a true story of him in the hospital, right? And then he said, hey, look, Jeff, they're patients. That's what they do. They vomit, right? Whose issue was it? Mine, right? The people who I want to work with who have experienced toxic stress will vomit. In fact, I should want to be at the point of vomit. The point of vomit becomes the ability or the opportunity to talk about people's history and help them learn about history. So that's where we're going to go with this. If it's about stopping the vomit, right? The vomit's the problem, then it's like taking away the weight. Does that make sense? I just want to make the connections. I'm making real fast connections. We only got a little bit of time. So again, incredible implications. I'm just going to scan through this really fast. This was done with 64,000 youth in Florida recently. And, you know, not surprising, amazing results. Over 50, in the original ACE study, only 3% of all people had ACEs of 0, right? Or I'm sorry, 34%. in the juvenile justice, the folks who are locked up, only 3% did, right? 50% of the young people in Florida reported ACEs 4 or more. Look at what you can expect if you have 4 or more. It's astounding. And of course, this kind of behavior then becomes what we penalize, what we begin to work around. So we're oftentimes saying, well, why do you have so many STDs? Why do you have so many multiple sex partners? Why are you absent so much? Why are you drinking so much? Why are you trying to kill yourself so much? Right? Look at that, 7 times more likely. And the key question to ask in an ACEs environment, an ACEs organization, is not why, but what happened to you that this behavior would make sense. So we want to move away from the behavior to the underlying cause. In a sense, we need to understand, like radiation, that people have been living around a nuclear reactor like Chernobyl, and their hair is falling out. And it'd be like saying, why is your hair falling out? None of us would ask that question if we had been at Chernobyl and our hair was falling out. We'd say, wow, we're too close to Chernobyl, right? Or if I'm going to go work at Chernobyl, I need to put on a suit, right? How many of us go and work in toxic environments and don't suit up? Aren't even aware of it. And organizations are just collections of brains that begin to be impacted by this. So again, just look at the ACEs study. This is kind of amazing. You see here, the yellow is the youth in Florida. This is the original ACEs group that was done. You can see it's directly opposite to that group as you measure it. So I just want to go back here. So, and this is what they were talking about of the 10 questions. The highest questions here, if you might not, I don't know if you can read this or not, but the highest questions for them: family violence, separation and divorce, and somebody being incarcerated. Those are the top 3 things that the majority of people, almost everybody, reported as happening in their life. You'll notice on here that school, a bad school, is not one of them. Experience in school is not one of them. 2/3 of folks, almost a little bit over 2/3, experienced 7 of these. So what do you think about that? How are you making sense out of that, what I'm saying?
Well, that's not in school, it's happening at home or in their day-to-day lives.
Okay. But how about these things? Like, let's think about this: family violence, separation, divorce, somebody incarcerated, and put it in the framework of, we're talking about immigration here. We talk a lot about immigration. I haven't heard any of these mentioned. We talk about policy, right? We talk about how we're thinking about justice today, right? Does any of the conversations that you've had about justice involve any of these? Like, for me, it was really stunning as someone who was trying to help youth get back in school to realize I had to start thinking about these pieces. Like, to help people get back in school required us as an organization to begin to shift and think about these components and how they damage the youth that we're working with, or how to create what we're going to call a healing community. Now, another study, I'm actually going to go by this. What's really amazing here is it's tied to wealth. And we'll see the racial breakdown here. The racial breakdown is exactly the same. What was the key determinant here around ACEs and high ACE scores was a person's household income, not their race. So I think, again, it's kind of a fascinating thing for us to look at and see, and there's one kind of skew here for this, and there's an explanation for that. But if we look at it, whether you're white, or you're black, or you're brown, if your brain experiences stress, toxic stress, overwhelmingly constant toxic stress, that you oftentimes have these outcomes. So the implications, so I'm going to kind of just wrap up and we'll have a couple questions. So the implications for us here, for this, I think for this conference, I just try to say is that we have to ask what has happened. Not why do people do what they do, but what's happened. And then when we think about prevention, like I think a lot of times we're focused on justice as prevention, like let's stop, mining practices. Let's have clean water, right? Really, really awesome things. We want everything to be like that, right? But the key thing is that we have a world that's been injured. and we're actually not attending oftentimes to the injury in the world. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay. We're not attending to the injury. We're oftentimes so much focused on prevention that when we get the things that we think are going to be so helpful, we're oftentimes really surprised that people don't respond the way that we think it should happen. So I mean, I'm just looking at this. 80% of the youth in Canada live below the poverty line. I said 1 out of 39 this year, 1 out of 35 last year were assaulted. This is ongoing lack of safety, which results in them creating coping mechanisms that move forward into their future, right? That in terms of these survival efforts that they have. If anyone saw the New York Times, I was going to put it in here, just, did anyone read about the guy who was in Rikers Island for 3 years because he didn't have bond? And then he finally gets out. It's this big thing going on now because people who are poor can't make bond. They get locked up. Terrible things happen to them. And what was really amazing in this article, terrible thing is he killed himself a couple years out of jail. But he talks about what it was like for him to live after the experience of jail, 3 years. And it's a classic trauma description of what happened to him and then what he was living out of. And there was no help for him with that. The sense was, well, he's not in jail, right? But the thing is he was terribly injured. And there was no societal response to his injury, to what had happened to him. We're beginning to have that frame. Anecdotally, we could always say that, right? People went to war and they came back and they were shell-shocked, right? That's what we would say. Now we can look at PET scans and see why the brain is doing what it's doing, right? So just a couple more things. So at HopeWorks, we moved, this is what we did. We used to think about creating safe pathways so youth could have dreams. I call that the deficit model. In a sense, we created an organization to provide things to people with the understanding that if they got the things, then they'd go on and have a fruitful life. That happened for a number of youth. It also didn't happen for a lot of youth. They would go to school and then they would fail out. They would get a job and they would blow it up, right? So about 5 years ago, we began to change to creating safe pathways so that we can learn our history and have options for the future. So in Dr. Folletti's ACEs, signature ACEs study, he found that simply by asking people what happened and people beginning to reveal what had happened to them, he had a 1/3 reduction in medical visitation. Like, it was really clear that resiliency began with naming what had happened. And once you begin able to name what's happened, you're able to start talking about the patterns that you've learned to cope. So at HopeWorks, we have a whole structure through our, what we call training, literacy, and what we call formation, where youth actually, when they vomit their pattern, right? That's what we would call it. Then we engage that, and we reflect on that, and we begin to ask them how it's helpful. It's a very beginning way we do it. And it's absolutely extraordinary. We had a youth who was going to the emergency room 3 times a week. He only goes to the emergency room now about once every 8 weeks, right? He's beginning to connect that his body is a way that he actually manages what's happened to him. And so in his life, what's really dangerous is that when he begins to feel stressed now, he literally is reliving what happened to him before. We call it a reenactment, right? And beginning to disconnect that so he can actually deal with being whatever's happening today differently than before is a key thing for him having options for the future. All right, so just one other thing here. So ACEs allows us to understand injury, what's happened to the brain becomes central, so that we can get to healing or resiliency, right? And just a couple other things. So just my thoughts, one of them is we talk a lot about juvenile reentry, and I'm always so surprised that we want people to re-enter the context that's been so damaging to them and then be different, right? So that would be like, we've locked you up and now we're going to send you back to Chernobyl and you'll act differently. Does that make sense? Does everyone follow the imagery? And we have to move from surviving to thriving. And for me, what's really powerful here is this notion of developing a deep empathy. So I think you might have heard me ask today about, I was the one who asked about racism and immigration, right? Because my experience is that empathy requires us to find the pieces of suffering, not out there, but here first. That we connect with people because we connect with our own history. We are historical people, and my experience a lot is that we oftentimes try to do justice ahistorically. We don't talk about the history and what's happened. We try to stop things, and it's as though I and whoever's being hurt or whatever, we've never, like we don't connect. It's as though we don't have flesh. And so I find trauma-informed care, this is what we're talking about, incredibly incarnational. Like it's really rooted in the fact that we have bodies, and our bodies, when they're hurt, we carry that hurt forward, and in the present, if we're not aware of that hurt, it will impact how we will be able to have a future. Right? Now, the really great thing, maybe this is the last thing I'll leave with, is that I find this work to be a way to connect with people. So I may be working in Camden with young Latinos and African Americans, and someone else may be down on the border working with Mexicans, and someone else may be over in the Middle East in Palestine, right? And we're all talking about not so much how the stress is happening, but we're talking about our brains. The connection is that our brains are all the same. We don't have a black or a white brain. Our brains, when they're impacted by toxic stress, violence, abuse, neglect, these kind of things, a lack of safety ongoingly, we all react the same way. Our genome is impacted. And to me, it's a great way for us to actually build coalitions of connection. So in our city, we broke our murder record. Oops, I think I'm done. We broke our murder record a couple years ago, and the county never cares about what happens in Camden, but when we started using this frame of like PTSD and depression and abuse, people in the county began to respond to Camden, not because they had experienced a shooting or the violence, but because they knew abuse. We had so many people who began to come forward about physical or sexual abuse, who could talk about depression, who could talk about their experiences of freeze or fight or flight. And so the connector became not the fact that, oh, you have to support people who, this community that's having great violence, but rather, you know what, in their community also, they've had great violence. It's a different kind of violence. Are you guys with me with that? Like, it was amazing to me to experience that. So a group of people who normally would never connect, who would be at odds, who would find a way to disconnect, right, actually connected, and it was at the place of their pain. So the very last thing was, I was just trying to do a riff here on men for others, men and women for others, right? And just really claiming that if we're going to be men and women for others, then we have to take serious that we're men and women have bodies, and bodies have histories. And we move forward in service and justice with our history. So oftentimes when we're with other people, our history is there. And if we're not in touch with our history, we can reenact it, and then we treat people really poorly, just like they can, in a sense, treat people poorly because we're trying to protect ourselves, right? We're trying to manage. We're always in an economy of managing our history until we name our history. And then it becomes really freeing for us. So, all right, I think I'm done. I went really fast. I really apologize. 2 minutes for questions. Are there any questions? Any thoughts?
So how has this helped you and your staff to sustain yourself, to stay in it for the long haul? Like,